Welcome to a Sherlock Holmes mystery. A murder with no footprints, a snow-covered garden with no escape, and a scarf from India strangling a lady of the manor. But when the son accuses the father, and silence becomes the loudest clue. Only Holmes can untangle a crime wrapped in red silk and buried in snow. Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Tell us below. London lay beneath a gauze of white that winter. The streets muffled in snow and the air thick with the stillness peculiar to Christmas Eve. Gas lamps shimmered through the mist, casting golden halos upon the frost, and distant bells tolled from Westminster, their solemn chime mingling with the laughter of late-night revellers. It was, by all appearances, a season of cheer and goodwill. Yet the knock that shattered the quiet of Baker Street that evening carried no warmth. I had been seated before the hearth, my pipe resting between two fingers, when Holmes, who had not stirred for over an hour, suddenly rose from his chair with that quicksilver alertness which presaged the scent of a case. "Someone in great distress," he murmured, glancing toward the door. "Note the urgency in the rhythm, Watson. It is not the measured rap of formality, but the uneven pounding of panic." Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man so pale and disheveled that he seemed more ghost than guest. His cloak was dusted with snow, his gloves soaked through, and his breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he gasped. "I beg of you, my family is in terrible danger." Holmes motioned him toward the fire. "Pray compose yourself, sir. You have come at an hour most Londoners reserve for carols and brandy, which tells me your errand is neither social nor trivial. Who are you, and what peril drives you through this weather?" The man drew himself upright with visible effort. "My name is Edward Montresor," he said. "I am steward to Lord Halberdine of Sussex, the Halberdine estate at Westmarch. A crime has been committed, Mr. Holmes, a dreadful one." Holmes' eyes gleamed with interest. "Go on." "The body of Lady Halberdine was found this afternoon lying in the snow outside her own conservatory. There were no footprints leading to or from the spot, though the ground was soft enough to take them. The window was locked from within. The servants swear no one entered or left. Yet she is dead, sir, strangled. I remember the words as clearly as though they were spoken yesterday." Holmes, who had been pacing before the fire, halted mid-step. "No footprints," he repeated softly. "No entry, no exit, and a locked window. That is most excellent." "Excellent," I exclaimed. "Holmes, the man's mistress has been murdered." Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, it is the mark of an uncommonly fine puzzle. I congratulate Mr. Montresor upon bringing it to us." The steward's face twitched with agitation. "You do not understand, sir. Lord Halberdine stands accused by his own son." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Ah, now that, indeed, complicates the matter. Pray continue." Montresor clutched his hat tighter. "There has been bitterness in the family for months, whispers of scandal, gambling debts, and an inheritance dispute. The younger son, Richard, returned from India last week. He and his father quarrelled violently yesterday morning over some matter I did not hear. When her ladyship was found dead, suspicion fell at once upon Lord Halberdine. He was seen near the conservatory shortly before the discovery. Scotland Yard has been called, but they lack imagination," Holmes finished. "Who heads the investigation?" "Then the case is safe for another day. Watson, the trains to Sussex run hourly, do they not? We shall take the morning express." I glanced at the window. The snow was deepening, and a greyish dawn struggled through the fog. "Surely, Holmes, you mean after Christmas?" "After Christmas," he replied. "There may be no mystery left to solve, only regret. Prepare your coat and revolver, my dear fellow. We go where logic leads. And logic, at present, points to Westmarch." Montresor looked visibly relieved. "You have my deepest gratitude, Mr. Holmes." Lord Halberdine himself has forbidden anyone to enter the conservatory until a man of your reputation arrives. The servants whisper of ghosts, of a curse that follows the Halberdine name. Ghosts, Watson, rarely trouble themselves to strangle their victims with silken cords. A very human hand did this, though one, I suspect, disguised with uncommon cunning. As Montresor departed into the swirling snow, Holmes turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You see, Watson," he said, "the essence of this affair lies not in the presence of death, but in the absence of its traces. A woman dies in the open air, on yielding ground, without mark of her killer's approach. That contradiction, my dear fellow, is the fingerprint of genius or madness, which we shall discover." He moved to the mantel, studying a single candle that burned low beside the clock. "Christmas," he murmured. "How curious that so many crimes should choose a holy day for their hour." Then, with sudden energy, he turned. "Pack the medical bag, Watson. There is work to be done, and I should not like to keep Lady Halberdine waiting in the cold." As the first light of dawn crept across Baker Street, I could not help but feel the familiar thrill of anticipation. Another case, another puzzle to stir the mind, and, perhaps, another glimpse into the unfathomable depths of Sherlock Holmes' extraordinary intellect. The morning broke cold and brittle, with the kind of light that seemed to crack upon the rooftops of London rather than warm them. By the time we reached Charing Cross, the streets were sheathed in ice, and the porter's breath steamed like smoke in the thin air. Holmes, wrapped in his grey travelling cloak and wearing that battered hat which had seen more mysteries than most policemen, strode briskly through the platform, his eyes alert, his manner almost cheerful. "The case, Watson," he said as we boarded the Sussex Express, "is a study in contradictions. A locked window, an open sky, and yet no footprints in the snow. Every physical law appears defied, but where nature seems to have erred, man has intervened." I settled into my seat opposite him, the rhythmic hiss of the engine filling the pause that followed. "You think, then, that someone took pains to conceal their movements?" "My dear fellow," Holmes replied, unfolding the morning paper with one gloved hand. "Concealment is the essence of murder. The only question is what, precisely, they sought to conceal. A motive, a presence, or perhaps something far more delicate, a mistake." He skimmed the columns idly, his gaze distant. "You observed, I trust, the steward's account of the quarrel between father and son. Anger is a blunt instrument, Watson, but guilt, guilt sharpens the blade. The son accuses the father, that is the headline. But behind every headline lies the truth that no one reads. I watched the landscape slip past in frozen silence, the skeletal trees, the dull gleam of river ice, the distant glint of farmhouses shuttered for the holiday. And you believe Lord Halberdine innocent?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that he is the wrong kind of man for such a crime. The aristocrat murders by neglect, not by strangulation. Still, belief is the enemy of deduction. We shall see." He folded the newspaper precisely and withdrew from his pocket a small notebook no larger than a matchbox covered in cryptic markings. "Lady Halberdine," he mused, tapping the page, "was last seen at 3 o'clock in her conservatory, tending to her plants. A sentimental occupation. At past, she was found dead upon the snow. Between those moments lies a gulf of 27 minutes, enough for a lifetime of deceit. I intend to measure every second of it." The train jolted forward, sending a shiver through the carriages. Holmes leaned toward the window, peering through the condensation. "Note, Watson, the snow. It preserves truth better than memory. A footprint once made is testimony that cannot be cross-examined, yet our murderer has managed to erase it altogether. That I find both impressive and insulting." His tone carried that peculiar excitement I had come to recognize the spark of the hunt. "There are only 3 possible explanations," he continued. "First, the snow was tampered with after the act. Second, the crime occurred elsewhere, and the body was placed where it was found. Third, and most unlikely, the killer never touched the ground, never touched Holmes, surely. An impossibility to you, perhaps. To me, merely improbable. You see, Watson, human ingenuity is a ladder without top rung. The conductor entered to check tickets, glancing curiously at my companion, whose expression was so intent that one might have mistaken him for a man solving the secrets of the universe rather than paying a fare. When the door closed behind us, Holmes resumed his monologue in a softer voice. Lestrade will already have his theory, he said. He will say that the husband quarreled with his wife, followed her to the conservatory, and in a fit of passion strangled her with her own scarf. He will cite the quarrel, the opportunity, and the absence of an alibi. It will be a tidy theory, too tidy. He opened his violin case. He always carried it when traveling, though rarely played, and from beneath the instrument drew a folded map of the Halberdine estate. Observe. The conservatory faces the east lawn, adjacent to the stables. The path between is gravel, yet the body was found 12 feet beyond the border, where the snow lay untouched. 12 feet, Watson. How did she arrive there, and how did her murderer vanish? The question hung between us like breath in cold air. I had no answer. Holmes smiled faintly, as if at my silence. Good. The first step toward knowledge is the confession of ignorance. He closed the map. At precisely 11:20, we shall arrive at Westmarch Station. Montresor will meet us with a carriage. You will observe, you will listen, and above all, you will refrain from theorizing. The facts are faithful servants, but they flee from imagination. As the whistle shrieked and the countryside blurred into a smear of white and shadow, I could not help but feel the gravity of what awaited us. Somewhere in the quiet halls of Westmarch lay a woman strangled without trace of her killer, a family torn by accusation, and a mystery that mocked the simplest laws of nature. And opposite me, draped in his cloak and smiling faintly into the fogged window, sat the one man in England capable of untangling it. Sherlock Holmes tapped the glass once with his finger. "When Christmas turns deadly, Watson," he said softly. "Even the snow remembers." The train hissed to a halt at Westmarch Station beneath a sky the color of iron. The platform was deserted save for a single carriage drawn up beside the lamplight, its wheels half buried in the snow. A figure in a heavy coat stepped forward as we descended Edward Montresor, his face drawn and his eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. He bowed hastily to Holmes and murmured, "My lord awaits you, sir. The household is unsettled." Holmes inclined his head. "So, I should imagine. Lead on, Mr. Montresor." We rode in silence through narrow, frost-choked lanes bordered by skeletal hedgerows. The countryside stretched before us in pale desolation, fields of snow broken only by the occasional dark smudge of a tree. As the horses labored uphill, the roofline of Westmarch appeared through the mist, a sprawling Gothic mass of gables and chimneys, its windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. Holmes leaned forward, his gaze fixed. "Ancestral decay," he murmured. "How swiftly grandeur turns to gloom when the soul of a house departs. Tell me, Montresor, who discovered the body?" "The housemaid, sir. Mary Atwood. She went to fetch holly for the dining table and found her ladyship lying upon the snow. She screamed for help, and the household came running. Lord Halberdine was in his study at the time, or so he claims." "And young Richard?" "He was seen in the library," Montresor replied, his tone uncertain, "though no one can vouch for him after 2 o'clock. Holmes made a soft humming sound, his eyes distant. 2 o'clock. The quarrel occurred in the morning, did it not?" "Yes, sir. It was overheard by the butler and one of the grooms. Heated words, something about money, and a letter from India. After that, they did not speak again." We turned through the great wrought-iron gates, the carriage wheels crunching over the frozen gravel. A tall figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. the lamplight behind him forming a halo about his grey head. Lord Halberdine was a man of perhaps 60, upright and severe, his thin face carved with lines of pride and fatigue. He extended a cold hand as we entered the great hall. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low but steady. "You come at a dark hour. I am grateful." Holmes bowed slightly. "I am at your service, my lord. I would like to view the body and the grounds at once, before the light fades." Halberdine's lips tightened. "As you wish. This way." He led us through a corridor lined with portraits, whose painted eyes seemed to follow our steps. The air grew colder as we approached the conservatory, a vast glass chamber now clouded with frost. Within, beneath a white sheet, lay the still form of Lady Halberdine. The snow outside pressed close against the glass panes, and beyond it, the faint imprint of a body's shape marred the otherwise perfect surface. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, then knelt beside the sheet and drew it back with reverent care. Lady Halberdine's face was pale as ivory, her features serene but for a faint bruise along the throat where a cord had bitten deep. A single strand of crimson silk clung to the wound. Holmes examined it closely, his fingers moving with surgical precision. "Silk scarf, Watson," he murmured. "Expensive, foreign weave. Note the pattern, Persian, perhaps Indian. Curious that such an item should find its way into an English winter." Lord Halberdine's expression did not change. "She was fond of exotic garments," he said quietly. "Her son brought her many gifts from abroad." Holmes' eyes flickered briefly. "Indeed." He rose and moved toward the door that opened onto the east lawn. The bolt was secure, the lock unbroken. He studied the glass panes, then the snow outside, where the faint outline of a body was still discernible. "Observe, Watson," he said softly. "The snow immediately surrounding the mark is undisturbed. No approach, no retreat. And yet, see here, along the edge, faint depressions. Not footprints, something lighter, perhaps the brushing of a cloth or rope." He turned suddenly to Montresor. "Was anything found nearby? Any object, however trivial?" "Only a lantern, sir. It was lying some yards away, unlit." "Bring it to me later," said Holmes, "and instruct the servants that no one is to enter this room until I have concluded my examination." As we left the conservatory, I glanced back once more at the still figure beneath the sheet. The sight of her so peaceful, so violated, filled me with an unease I could not shake. In the corridor, Holmes paused, his face shadowed by thought. "A son from India," he murmured. "An exotic scarf. A death without footprints. Watson, we are standing at the edge of a pattern too fine for the naked eye, but given time and light, it will reveal itself." Outside, the wind howled through the frozen gardens, scattering the snow like white ash. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled for evening prayers, and in that lonely sound I felt the full weight of the mystery that had brought us to Westmarch, one that even Christmas itself seemed powerless to redeem. The drawing-room at Westmarch was a vast, shadowed chamber lit by the uncertain glow of a single fire. Portraits of Halberdine's past stared grimly from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow Holmes as he moved from corner to corner, his steps silent upon the carpet. Lord Halberdine sat in an armchair near the fire, his hands clasped tightly upon the head of his cane. Beside him stood Richard Halberdine, tall, restless, and visibly stricken, his dark hair unkempt and his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. It was the first time father and son had shared the same room since the tragedy, and the air between them seemed alive with tension. Holmes surveyed them both with the cool detachment of a physician examining patients before diagnosis. "I understand," he began quietly, "that there was a quarrel yesterday morning. Might I trouble you, my lord, for the particulars?" Lord Halberdine's mouth tightened. "A private matter, Mr. Holmes." "Private, perhaps," Holmes said gently, "but it may hold the key to your wife's death." The old man hesitated, then looked toward his son. "Richard accused me of withholding money that was rightfully his. I have no doubt he will repeat that charge here." Richard took a sharp step forward. I accused you, father, of deceit, nothing less. Mother confided to me that you meant to alter the will. She feared you would leave her destitute if she opposed you. Lord Halberdine rose with sudden fury. Lies! The boy squanders every crise, shilling on cards and foreign trifles. I forbade further allowance, that is the truth of it. Holmes raised a hand. Gentlemen, I beg you, emotion obscures logic. Let us adhere to fact. The quarrel occurred before luncheon? Yes, said Richard curtly. Shortly before 11. And afterward? My lord? I remained in my study until the alarm was raised. My secretary, Mr. Grant, will confirm as much. Excellent. And you, Mr. Richard, where were you between 2 and 3 o'clock? In the library, he said after a pause. Reading? Alone? Yes. Holmes regarded him steadily. You brought gifts from India, I believe. Among them a certain silk scarf? Richard blinked. Yes, one of several. They were meant for my mother. Were they all alike? He frowned. No. Each was distinct. The red one, the one she wore, was embroidered by hand. I bought it in Bombay. Holmes's eyes flickered with quiet satisfaction. I see. And who last saw her alive? Montresor, who had been standing in the doorway, spoke up. I did, sir. Around 3. She was arranging holly near the conservatory window. She seemed thoughtful, though not unhappy. Holmes nodded slowly, then turned to me. Watson, we shall view the study next. Lord Halberdine's voice, though steady, carried a weary resignation. Do as you must, Mr. Holmes. I have nothing to conceal. The study lay across the hall, its walls lined with books and its desk buried under a confusion of papers. Holmes moved through the room like a cat, touching nothing yet seeing everything. He paused at the fireplace, where a faint scent of burnt paper lingered. With the poker, he stirred the ashes gently. A half-charred fragment fluttered upward, bearing the remains of a signature. He caught it between his fingers and examined it under the light. Part of a letter, he murmured. Watson. Note the ink. It is not English manufacture. The texture suggests Indian fiber. A letter burned in haste, perhaps within the hour of the crime. He replaced it delicately and turned back to the room. Montresor, he said, did her ladyship receive correspondence from abroad? Occasionally, sir. Usually from merchants or acquaintances of Mr. Richard. Holmes' eyes met mine. Curious. Burned letters, foreign silk, and a death performed without trace in the snow. The East has reached deep into this English household. As we stepped out into the corridor, a servant approached hurriedly, her apron trembling in her hands. Beg pardon, sir, she stammered, but the lantern you asked for, it's gone. Vanished from the conservatory. Holmes's face darkened. Vanished, you say? Yes, sir. When I went to fetch it, it was no longer there. He turned sharply toward the stairs. Then someone in this house fears discovery more than the cold. Watson, we shall not sleep tonight. The murderer moves still among us. The firelight flickered across the long corridor as he spoke, and in its shifting glow I thought I saw, for the briefest instant, the glint of something red upon the banister, a single silken thread, trembling in the draught. Night had fallen heavily upon West March, smothering the house in a silence so deep it seemed almost sentient. The snowstorm outside pressed against the windows with a dull hiss, and the long corridors were lit only by the wavering glow of gas lamps. Holmes had refused supper, preferring instead to wander the hallways with a lantern in hand, pausing every so often to crouch and examine some minute detail invisible to my untrained eye. Observe, Watson, he said quietly as we stood near the base of the grand staircase. Here, where the marble meets the carpet, what do you see? I peered down, baffled. Dust, perhaps, nothing more. Holmes smiled faintly. Exactly. Dust everywhere except for this narrow line, scarcely an inch wide, running parallel to the stair. Someone passed here recently carrying something long and narrow, brushing the surface clean, possibly the missing lantern or a rope. A rope. Indeed. Recall the faint depressions near Lady Halberdine's body, too light for footprints. I am beginning to suspect she did not walk into the snow of her own will. He rose and gestured toward the upper landing. Come, the servants' quarters are above. We may find what the daylight concealed. The stair creaked beneath our boots as we ascended, the air growing colder with each step. From somewhere in the distance came the faint ticking of a clock and the low murmur of voices behind closed doors. When we reached the top, Holmes turned left and opened a narrow door leading into a storage loft. The space was dim and cluttered with trunks, ropes, and old furnishings draped in dust sheets. Holmes moved like a predator, silent, precise. His lantern swept across the floor until it caught on something that glimmered faintly beneath an old chair. He stooped and retrieved it, a scrap of red silk, torn and knotted at one end. The scarf, I breathed. Part of it, Holmes corrected. Note the frayed edge. The remainder was used elsewhere. A portion of this fabric was cut deliberately, perhaps to fashion a garrote. And the knot, see how it's been twisted? Not by accident, Watson. This is the work of a sailor or a soldier accustomed to rope. I felt a chill unrelated to the cold air. Then Richard, he served in India, did he not? Holmes' expression gave nothing away. He did, but let us not conclude before we know. Facts first, guilt later. He straightened and turned his light toward the far end of the room, where a small window stood open to the storm. The wind tore through it, scattering dust like ash. Holmes examined the sill. No snow within, he murmured, which means the window was opened after the storm began within the last few hours. Someone sought to dispose of something. Perhaps the missing lantern. A sudden knock at the door made us both start. It was Montresor, pale and anxious. Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade has arrived from London. He insists upon seeing you at once. Holmes sighed. Our friend from Scotland Yard never travels without his own theory. Come, Watson, we must brace for mediocrity. We descended to the great hall, where Lestrade stood stamping the snow from his boots. He was bundled in his heavy overcoat, his thin face red from the cold but alive with smug satisfaction. Ah, Holmes, I've no doubt you've been playing at puzzles again, but the case is simple enough. The sun did it. Motive, opportunity, and a damning bit of evidence besides. Holmes's brows lifted. Indeed? Do enlighten us. Lestrade reached into his coat and produced a small velvet pouch. Found this behind the library desk, a gold cufflink engraved with Lady Halberdine's initials, stained with what appears to be blood. The son's coat sleeve is missing its pair. Holmes examined the item with calm detachment. Interesting. And yet, Lestrade, you astonish me. You have learned nothing from experience. If a criminal leaves behind such evidence, it is either carelessness or cunning, and Richard Halberdine, whatever else he may be, is not careless. Lestrade scowled. Then you mean to say what? That the old man killed his wife? Holmes did not answer. He walked instead to the mantel and studied the clock, which ticked loudly in the heavy silence. Tell me, Lestrade, what time did the snow begin to fall yesterday? 2:30, by the records. Holmes smiled faintly. Then, Lady Halberdine died before that hour, for if she had died after, there would have been fresh snow upon the body, and there was none. He turned abruptly toward Montresor. Find Mr. Grant, the secretary. Bring him here at once. When Montresor hurried off, Holmes faced Lestrade again, his eyes gleaming. You see, my dear Inspector, your theory collapses at the first touch of time. The sun was in the library long after the storm began. The true culprit acted earlier and with forethought. Before dawn, I intend to know his name. Outside, the wind rose into a shriek, rattling the windows like the breath of the dead, and as I looked at Holmes's face, illuminated by the fire's glow, I saw that curious light of triumph kindling in his eyes, the unmistakable glint that meant the chase was nearing its end. Montresor returned within minutes, breathless, followed by a slender man with a pale, nervous face and ink-stained fingers. Mr. Grant, the secretary. He bowed stiffly, though the tremor in his hands betrayed the calm his manner tried to convey. Holmes gestured toward the armchair opposite the fire. "Pray, be seated, Mr. Grant. There are one or two matters upon which I should like your assistance." The secretary swallowed hard. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. Anything I can do to help my master." Holmes regarded him keenly. "You have been in Lord Halberdine's service for how long?" 3 years, sir." "And you were here yesterday at the time of Lady Halberdine's death?" "Yes, sir. I was working in the study with his lordship until shortly before 3. Holmes nodded. "When you left the study, where did you go?" "I went to the servants' hall to draft letters for the morning post." "Alone?" Grant hesitated. "Yes, that is, I believe so." Holmes' eyes glinted. "You believe so? Memory is the least loyal of witnesses, Mr. Grant. Let us be precise. Between 2:30 and 3 o'clock, did you see or hear Lady Halberdine?" "No, sir," the secretary said quickly. "I had no cause to be near the conservatory." Holmes tilted his head. "Yet you drafted correspondence using Indian stationery, I presume?" Grant stiffened. "Yes, sir. His lordship has a stock of imported paper." Holmes turned toward Lestrade. "You see, Inspector? The same fiber found in the burnt fragment in the fireplace. Curious coincidence, is it not?" Grant's face blanched. I know nothing of any letter." "Then perhaps you can explain why the ashes in Lord Halberdine's grate contain traces of sealing wax and gilt dust, the remnants of an official crest." The man's composure wavered. "It may have been one of the old drafts. His lordship often burns unwanted documents." And yet the handwriting on that fragment, he withdrew the charred scrap from his pocket and held it under the light, "is not his lordship's. It is yours." Grant's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Lestrade gave a short, triumphant laugh. "Ha! So he burned something after all! A confession, perhaps?" Holmes ignored him. His gaze never left the trembling secretary. "You burned a letter, Mr. Grant, a letter that arrived from India 2 days ago. It bore the name of one William Forsyth, a trader and associate of Mr. Richard Halberdine. It contained evidence of an investment swindle, one that implicated you." Grant's eyes darted wildly toward the door. "That's not true. How could you know that?" Holmes's tone was almost kind. "Because your handwriting betrays you. You forged the correspondence to appear as though it had come from India, then burned the evidence when you realized Lady Halberdine had discovered the deceit. She confronted you, perhaps in the conservatory. You panicked. There was a struggle, and the scarf at hand became your weapon. The room fell utterly still. The crackle of the fire sounded unnaturally loud. Grant's voice, when it came, was hoarse. "You have no proof." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, I have several. The torn scrap of silk upstairs bears your knot, an exact match to the one you used to tie your correspondence bundle. The lantern you hid through the attic window was found an hour ago in the shrubs below, still bearing the oil from your desk lamp. And finally, your boots." He gestured toward them. "Size 8, with a worn heel on the left. Precisely the impression left upon the carpet near the conservatory door before the servants swept it clean." Grant sagged in his chair, his fingers clawing at the armrest. "She threatened to tell his lordship," he whispered. "She said she would expose me and ruin everything. I meant only to silence her, to plead with her, but she fought me. The scarf was in her hand, and then—" He covered his face, shuddering. "I never meant to kill her." Lestrade straightened, satisfaction glowing in his narrow eyes. "You'll have time to explain that to a magistrate." Holmes's expression remained grave. "Inspector, you will find that Mr. Grant attempted to shift suspicion to young Richard by planting the cufflink. The blood upon it, I suspect, is from a paper cut upon his own hand." As the handcuffs closed around the secretary's wrists, The great clock of Westmarch struck midnight. The wind had died. The snow had ceased. Holmes turned to Lord Halberdine, who stood pale and silent by the hearth. "Your lady was the victim of deceit, my lord, not hatred. It was the desperation of a man cornered by his own lies." Outside, the first faint bells of Christmas morning drifted through the still air. Holmes watched the snow settle once more upon the garden, his face unreadable. "Peace on earth," he murmured. "A fine sentiment, Watson, but alas, rarely observed." And with that, the case of When Christmas Turned Deadly reached its quiet, solemn conclusion. The next morning dawned bleak and soundless, as though the snow itself sought to smother the memory of the night's confession. Westmarch Manor stood wrapped in a mantle of white, its towers gleaming faintly through a veil of mist. Inside, however, the air was heavy. Grief and fatigue hung over the house like incense. The servants moved in whispers. Even the fire in the great hall burned lower than usual, as if reluctant to disturb the hush. Holmes, who had slept not at all, sat by the window with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. His eyes were distant yet alive with that strange inner fire that burned most brightly once the chase was ended. I joined him quietly, a cup of steaming tea in my hand. "You've not closed your eyes all night," I said, "and yet you seem content." He smiled faintly. "Sleep is but an indulgence, my dear Watson. The mind, once set alight, must burn through the last wisp of curiosity before it may rest. The facts are known, the culprit confessed, but the motive structure still amuses me." I took the chair opposite him. He claimed desperation, fear of exposure. Surely that explains all. Holmes shook his head slowly. Desperation alone seldom crafts so elaborate a deceit. Grant's actions were guided by precision, letters forged, evidence arranged, suspicion artfully misdirected. That is the work of intellect, not panic. What troubles me is the origin of that intellect. Who taught him the art? Before I could reply, Montresor entered softly, his face pale from the strain of the preceding hours. "Inspector Lestrade departed before dawn, sir. Mr. Grant has been taken to the County Gaol. Lord Halberdine asks whether you might spare him a moment before you leave." Holmes rose at once. "Of course. It would be ungracious to depart without a final word." We followed Montresor down the corridor to the library. Lord Halberdine stood by the hearth, his figure silhouetted against the pale glow of the fire. He looked older, years older than the day before. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I owe you a debt I can never repay. You have preserved my name, my son, and what remains of my sanity. Though my wife's death will shadow this house forever, I am grateful that truth, at least, has prevailed." Holmes inclined his head. "Truth is rarely the guest of comfort, my lord, but it is the only one that endures. If I might offer advice, dismiss Mr. Grant's replacements with care. The cleverest servants are often the most dangerous." Lord Halberdine managed a weary smile. "You have the gratitude of Westmarch. May I ask, how did you perceive his guilt so swiftly?" Holmes's eyes glimmered with quiet amusement. "It was his silence that betrayed him. When a man knows nothing, he is voluble. When he knows too much, he grows cautious. Grant spoke little, but each word he uttered was chosen as though weighed in fear. That, my lord, is the unmistakable accent of guilt." As we prepared to depart, Richard Halberdine entered the room, his expression subdued. He took Holmes's hand firmly. "I have wronged my father and judged him unjustly," he said. "If not for you, I might have carried that shame all my life. You have done more than uncover a crime, Mr. Holmes. You have restored a family." Holmes looked momentarily uncomfortable, as though praise were a coat that did not fit. "Nonsense, my dear fellow. I have merely rearranged the facts into their proper order. It is you who must now keep them there." Outside, the carriage awaited, steam rising from the horses as the winter sun broke faintly through the clouds. Holmes stood for a moment on the drive, drawing his cloak about him and gazing back at the house. Curious. he murmured as we climbed aboard. The architecture of deceit so often mirrors the structure of the human mind, grand, proud, and yet crumbling at its foundation. The wheels turned, crunching over the frozen road as Westmarch receded behind us. I watched Holmes, his profile outlined against the window, his gaze fixed on some unseen horizon. "You're troubled still," I said. "What more could remain?" He smiled without turning. "Only this, Watson. Grant confessed to killing Lady Halberdine, but not to burning the letter. That act occurred earlier, before her death. Someone else sought its destruction and succeeded." The revelation struck me cold. "Then you believe?" "I believe," he said softly, "that certain truths, once buried, prefer to remain so, and perhaps Lord Halberdine's peace depends upon our discretion." The countryside slipped past us in silence, white fields gleaming beneath a pale Sunday. After a time, Holmes leaned back, closed his eyes, and murmured almost to himself, "Christmas, Watson, the season of forgiveness. Let us, for once, grant it." And so, as the train carried us back to London through the falling snow, I reflected upon the curious nature of justice, that even when its blade is honed to perfection, Holmes could choose to sheathe it for mercy's sake. The case of When Christmas Turned Deadly ended not with triumph, but with a kind of peace, and in that quiet, I found the rarest of things, a glimpse of the humanity within the world's coldest reasoner. The return journey to London was cloaked in silence. The train swayed gently through the snowbound countryside, its rhythmic clatter blending with the faint whisper of wind against the windows. Holmes sat opposite me, eyes half closed, his long fingers resting loosely upon his knees. The morning light filtered through the frost-veiled glass, painting his face with a pallor that made him seem carved from marble. I knew better than to interrupt him when he wore that expression, the look of a mind still turning the final pieces of a puzzle long after the board had been cleared. After nearly an hour, he spoke. "Watson, you recall the lantern that vanished from the conservatory?" "Of course," I said. "It was found in the shrubbery, as you predicted." "Yes," he murmured. "But note the inconsistency. Grant confessed to hiding it, yet he could not have thrown it from the attic window where I found the open frame. His story placed him in the servants' hall at that time. I suspect someone assisted him willingly or otherwise." I frowned. "You think there was an accomplice?" Holmes's smile was faint, almost melancholy. "Not in the act of murder, but in the suppression of evidence. Someone moved the lantern later, perhaps to mislead me, perhaps to protect another. But the act itself, that was human compassion in conflict with law." I leaned forward. "You speak of Lord Halberdine?" He met my gaze briefly, then looked away. He loved his wife, Watson. That much was evident in every gesture, every silence. Yet he also loved his reputation and his family name. When he discovered Grant's betrayal, I believe he tried to suppress it, to shield his household from scandal. It was he who burned the letter before her death, not Grant. Lady Halberdine must have known of it. Their argument over the inheritance was not born of greed, but of conscience. She wished her son to know the truth. He wished to bury it with her silence. The weight of those words settled over us like the falling snow outside. "Then," I said slowly, "she went to confront Grant, armed with knowledge her husband destroyed, and paid for it with her life." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. The tragedy of Westmarch lies not in malice, but in the chain of concealments that preceded the crime. Had one truth been spoken, no death would have followed. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The train thundered over a viaduct, the landscape unfolding beneath us in a sweep of white fields and frozen rivers. At last, Holmes drew his cloak tighter and turned to me with a weary smile. "You see now, my dear fellow, why I refrained from mentioning this to Lestrade. The law is a blunt instrument. It punishes the deed, not the cause. Lord Halberdine's silence was not guilt, but grief." I studied him quietly. "And you, Holmes, do you never weary of bearing the world's secrets?" He chuckled softly. "On the contrary, Watson, secrets are the only currency worth collecting." But even I recognize that there are times when truth serves no purpose but pain. The train whistle sounded, long and mournful, as the outskirts of London appeared through the haze. Chimneys smoked, carriages rattled, and life resumed its usual pulse of indifference. The city seemed almost to mock the solemn grandeur of the countryside we had left behind. Holmes rose, stretching his limbs with deliberate ease. Another case closed, another candle extinguished. Tell me, Watson, does it not strike you as odd that the season of goodwill produces such a harvest of crimes? I smiled, despite myself. Perhaps the better angels of our nature grow drowsy with excess brandy. He laughed quietly. A sound hypothesis. You should publish it in the Lancet. When we reached Baker Street, dusk had already settled over the city. Mrs. Hudson met us with her usual mixture of warmth and disapproval, declaring that no sane man should be abroad on Christmas morning. Holmes merely waved her concern aside, hung his coat, and went straight to his violin. Within moments, the familiar strains of a soft nocturne filled the room, mournful, tender, and strangely comforting. As I sat by the fire, I could not help but think of the Halberdynes, their house now emptied of joy, their secrets buried beneath snow. Yet there was a peculiar peace in it too, a sense that the world had righted itself, if only slightly. Holmes lowered his bow and looked toward the hearth, where the flames flickered low. You see, Watson, he said quietly, evil seldom announces itself with grandeur. It creeps in, quiet as frost, and men mistake it for necessity. Our task is only to see where it has touched and to name it. Outside, the bells of street Pauls began to toll, solemn and slow, echoing through the fog. Holmes smiled faintly, his gaze distant once more. Merry Christmas, my dear friend, he said. Let us be grateful that logic, at least, remains incorruptible. And, as the snow began again to fall upon Baker Street, the sound of his violin rose softly through the night, an elegy for a woman wronged, a family redeemed, and a detective who, for one fleeting moment, allowed mercy to triumph over reason. The winter sun had climbed weakly above the rooftops of London by the time Holmes stirred from his chair. The remnants of the morning papers lay scattered about the hearthrug. Their columns had long since ceased to interest him. He had been sitting in perfect stillness for nearly an hour, the thin stream of pipe smoke rising straight as a candle wick in the quiet air. I recognized that posture. Well, it was the calm that preceded a storm of thought. Holmes, I said at last, you have not spoken a word since breakfast. Surely even your mind must rest after such a case. He smiled faintly, though his eyes never left the fire. Rest, my dear Watson, is for the body. The mind, once engaged, resists dismissal. Tell me what remains of the Halberdyne affair in your estimation. I considered the question. Justice was served, the truth revealed, and the innocent spared. What more could one ask? Ah, Holmes murmured, you think in terms of conclusion. I, on the other hand, think in echoes. Every crime leaves them. Some fade, others persist. The Halberdynes will go on living with ghosts not of their dead, but of their silence. And silence, Watson, is the most enduring accomplice of all. He rose suddenly, pacing the room with that restless energy that returned whenever thought gave way to movement. You see, there was an unspoken thread through it all, a theme as constant as the snow. The husband who burned a letter to preserve honor, the secretary who killed to preserve deceit, and the detective who chose silence to preserve peace. 3 acts of concealment, each differing in motive, but identical in form. You astonish me, I said. Would you then call your own silence a crime? Holmes paused by the window. The fog outside was lifting, revealing the steady bustle of Baker Street below. Not a crime, he said softly, merely a concession to mercy. The world is not made better by every truth uncovered. Some wounds heal only when left unexamined. He turned from the window and took up his violin. You see, Watson, that is the paradox of our profession. We exist to expose what men would hide, and yet, from time to time, we must hide what we have exposed. And the room filled with a low, haunting note that seemed to hover like breath in the cold air. I sometimes wonder, he said between strokes, if justice itself is but a convenient fiction, useful, orderly, and hopelessly imperfect. We restore balance, perhaps, but not innocence. That was lost the moment Lady Halberdine stepped into her conservatory. I watched him play, and in that moment, I glimpsed something beneath the veneer of precision that had always defined him, a trace of sorrow, perhaps even fatigue. He was a man who solved riddles not to conquer them, but to quiet the noise they made within his mind. And yet, I sensed this one would not fall silent so easily. A knock interrupted my thoughts. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a telegram upon a silver tray. Holmes set down his violin, tore open the envelope, and scanned its contents. His brows arched slightly. "Well," he said, "it seems Scotland Yard cannot celebrate Christmas without me. Lestrade begs my presence at once, a most curious theft in Belgravia. He calls it a robbery of reason itself." I laughed. "You'll not grant yourself even a single day's peace?" He reached for his coat. "My dear Watson, peace is a myth invented by the complacent. Action is the only tonic that keeps a man alive." Within minutes, we were descending the familiar stairs, the chill air of Baker Street rushing to meet us. Outside, the snow had ceased, leaving the streets glistening like glass. A passing cab splashed through the slush, and Holmes raised his hand to hail it. As we climbed inside, he turned to me with that bright, almost boyish gleam I knew so well. "You see, Watson," he said, "the game does not end, it merely changes its board. Last night we dealt with the tragedy of concealment. Today, perhaps, we shall confront the folly of revelation. Either way, London will not disappoint us." And with that, the cab lurched forward, carrying us once more into the vast machinery of the city, the restless theatre where crime and reason forever danced their intricate waltz. The bells of street Paul's were still tolling faintly in the distance when Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closing, and murmured with a trace of satisfaction, "When Christmas turns deadly, Watson, it reminds us that even in the season of light, the shadows still demand their hour." The city swallowed us then, and I, notebook in hand, prepared once more to follow him into whatever darkness awaited. London wore its usual mask of indifference by the time we returned from Belgravia later that evening. The fog had thickened again, not the clear, crystalline cold of the countryside, but the dense, yellow murk that clung to the city's buildings and seeped into the bones. As our cab pulled up before 221B Baker Street, the gas lamps swam in a halo of mist, and the rattle of wheels seemed muffled by a world wrapped in cotton. Holmes alighted silently, coat drawn close, and mounted the stairs with the weariness of a man who had answered too many questions in a day and asked too few of his own. Inside, the fire had been lit anew, and Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully laid out a modest supper of bread, cheese, and a decanter of claret. But Holmes, with that peculiar monastic detachment of his, ignored it all and returned directly to the violin. His fingers played softly, aimlessly, at first no melody, just a searching murmur like wind against glass. I sat nearby, my own limbs aching from the long day, and opened my journal to resume my notes on the Halberdine affair. "Holmes," I said after a long silence, "do you ever fear that in exposing so many shadows, we bring some of them home with us?" He did not stop playing, but his tone was thoughtful. "It is a risk, Watson. We stare too long into the abyss, and it stares back. But the greater risk is in ignoring the abyss entirely. Justice may not heal all wounds, but it prevents infection. That must suffice." I nodded slowly. "You spoke earlier of echoes, how crimes never truly end. I keep thinking of Richard Halberdine. What must it be to live with the knowledge that one's own suspicions nearly condemned an innocent father?" Holmes set down the violin at last and turned toward me. That, Watson, may be the truest punishment of all. For guilt imposed by the law fades with time. Guilt carried in the heart rarely does. He poured himself a glass of claret and took a seat by the fire, the flickering light throwing sharp angles across his face. But let us not forget that the Halberdine affair, for all its tragedy, was also a portrait of restraint. The elder Halberdine, in burning the letter, believed he was protecting his son from shame. The son, in returning from India, sought to mend a fractured inheritance. Even Grant, our murderer, acted not out of rage but desperation. It was a house of cards, built on good intentions and collapsing under the weight of silence. I turned a page in my notebook, pausing before I wrote, "And you, Holmes, was your silence truly necessary?" He regarded me for a moment, then leaned back with a sigh. Necessary? Perhaps not, but valuable. Sometimes a case requires not just deduction, but discretion. I could have exposed Lord Halberdine's role in concealing the letter. I could have turned the law against him as easily as I did against Grant. But to what end? To shame a grieving husband? To cast further shadow upon a family already dimmed by death? He shook his head. I chose instead to leave a thread unpulled, not for lack of clarity, but in favor of mercy. There is an art in knowing when not to speak, Watson, one I suspect few detectives ever learn. The clock struck 8. Outside, the carolers had begun to gather at the corners of the streets, their songs faintly audible through the frosted window panes. God rest ye merry. Gentlemen floated through the air, eerily calm after the tumult of the last 2 days. Holmes listened, unmoving. I sometimes wonder, he said at length, if the world is as it seems, or merely a theatre of illusions in which we are all both players and audience. In Westmarch, the illusion was peace. Here in London, it is order. But underneath both lies a chaos that no one truly understands. I closed the notebook slowly. And yet, I said, you bring light to that chaos. A single match in a dark room. Holmes did not reply. He reached instead for the violin once more and, after a moment's pause, began to play not one of his usual morose improvisations, but a slow, gentle rendition of the first Noel. It filled the room like snowfall, quiet, inevitable, pure. When he finished, he set the violin aside, his voice no more than a whisper. Let that be my benediction, Watson, for this case, for the year, and perhaps for the soul. And in the stillness that followed, I felt that we had not just closed a case, but turned a page. The world outside remained uncertain, filled with crime and sorrow, but within the warmth of Baker Street, there was for now a kind of peace.